first country calendar I directed was the very first wine harvest that Montana did at Blenheim, which produced that magnificent oversweet vintage called Blenheimer, which remained on the shelves for years and years to come. Since then, the area, of course, has become more sophisticated. But so wine and country calendar was my first foray into television in New Zealand, really. It was single system film. Not just film, but film with the sound striped down the sides. So there are all sorts of things you had to worry about when you were actually filming it, and more so when you were editing it. And people would, as they still do, I'm sure, poke their heads into the editing booths where there are young trainees sweating away, saying things like, "Does it look any better?" People Like Us was a religious program. And the presenter was Jeff Robinson, who was on Morning Report. And it was great working with that because, again, it gave you the opportunity of working with a lot of directors, doing little stories. The content was, in a sense, irrelevant to creating structures that worked. But it gave you opportunity. I mean, we used to shoot bands and things, and we do all sorts of things, and those were opportunities that you never got again. I mean, over the time I was there, I can't remember exactly, but I would have been there for at least a year or more. We did bands every second week, and we do all sorts of strange stuff, and we do specifically kind of artistic things. You know, we made a gorgeous little film, I remember, at a retreat in Lower Hutt, and we only used music and candlelight. And you could do that if your item was only 7 minutes long, you know. Tomorrow's World was a science program that was a joint venture between Television New Zealand and BBC Manchester. And it was good because it was the first time that I had worked closely as a researcher, you know, as a mere Kiwi underling, with a BBC team. And they were just magnificent, you know. Their scripts were perfect. I worked with a presenter called Raymond Baxter, and we were driving along some back road up north somewhere, a shingled road, unsealed road. And I said to him, "You're probably not, you know, used to these kinds of roads back in the UK." And he just turned to me and said, "One more section in the Monty, old chap." And he'd won the saloon car section in the Monte Carlo Rally, you know. So they were great, but they were also responsive to New Zealand talent because I introduced them to Sharon Crosby, and Sharon Crosby became the New Zealand presenter, and you know, she was fabulous. It was beset by all sorts of ideological and management problems. The problems were, should it be in Māori or should it be in English? Was it a program for Māori people or was it a program for non-Māori people? There was a huge differential between native speakers and experienced broadcasters like Selwyn Muru and newbies like me and a lot of other people. And it was interesting because there was this intercity kind of tension there all the time. And I tried to look around to see, you know, how I could understand this within television terms. And the only place I found it was actually in an English program called A Gay Life. And they had exactly the same problems. You know, was there a program for gay people or for straight people? You know, was it for out people or people who weren't? And it was really interesting. And that program, in fact, collapsed under these tensions after a few years, but Māori programs continued. So it was an interesting way of just, you know, kind of managing all of those processes and all of those forces when in a society which has, you know, got many people and many different interests and, you know, ambitions, that a particular segment of that community, which represents the same thing as the general community, only has one mouthpiece. Our People, Our Century was my first real experience of doing proper history on television. There was always the issue of, you know, whether people would be interested in it. Anyone who says they're not is absolutely wrong. There are now, dedicated channels to history telling. There was the problems of whether or not it was entertainment or information, all those sort of other things. But I mean, it was the first example of being involved in a history television program that used the best historians in the country to basically reach out beyond the academy, reach out beyond the university to try and popularise New Zealand history without doing damage to the content. And it was it was one of the best experiences, really, of my television career, because we had all these guys sitting around tables and you'd ask them questions. We'd ask a silly question like, did people have servants in 1900? And their reply would be, oh, well, there was a census in 1901 that said 9.3% of the population had servants, but by 1922 it was only, 0.93. Fantastic stuff, this was all there. They knew everything. They knew how many chickens were in people's backyards in the 1950s. We used to have to nominate the number of chickens we kept in censuses right up through to the 50s. Frontier of Dreams was a much bigger project. And a much more, a project that looked in more detail at a broader sweep of history. But again, we used the same historians, and some loon, I can't remember his name now, but wanted to do a study on whether or not this would be official government history, because government historians who are employed by the Ministry of Culture and Heritage were helping to write it. Absolute rubbish. I mean, Simon Sharma says that, every historian who opens his mouth tells a personal history. What's government history? But, I mean, in this case, it clearly wasn't. There were a huge variety of different voices, different people, our writers, historian writers, and it was a hugely exciting and interesting and stimulating collaborative process. And you just, you don't see that anymore. That series would definitely not get funded today. The production assistant, or the main production assistant on that program, was able to wheedle down everybody in their archives costs. I remember her name was Carolyn Harper, and she once rang the Swedish company that owned the rights to the Kon-Tiki expedition. And they were really expensive because, they just think it's international television, so it's thousands. And she said, oh, we're only New Zealand, we're only a tiny little country, And they said, how much have you got? And she said, oh, a couple of $100. And they said, oh, fine. The only people that wouldn't reduce their charges were the International Olympic Committee and the Rugby Union. The very, very last piece of film that we put into the series was the colour footage of Peter Snell winning his gold medal in Rome. And we put it in last because it was thousands of dollars. I think it was $5, $6, $7, possibly, I might be wrong, but it might have been $15,000 for like 30 seconds. So it was the last of the money we had. We'd originally cut in the crappy, ugly black and white footage, but it was the last money we had left, so we put in the colour footage.